So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk to you tonight about the judgment in the valley of decision. This is basically chapter number 4 if you have a Hebrew Bible. If you don't, if you're running out of a King James or an NIV or any of the others, you're actually looking at chapter 3. And it's the same verse order, but in the Hebrew Bible, 5 verses of chapter 2 have been broken up into its own section. So basically, in Hebrew, we have 4 chapters. In English, we have 3. But it doesn't make any difference. The language is still the same. It's just different. We're going to talk about a man who's a mystery. And the reason I call him a mystery is because as we're looking at this, there is very little information that tells us who Joel is. Joel's one of the earliest prophets from the best we can understand, because he starts or begins a process called knowing about the day of the Lord. He's the first one to talk about it. Since then, after that, it was found in Jeremiah, and it's found in Ezekiel and Isaiah and several other books of the Bible. But he was apparently the first one from the best we can understand, because our problem with this is the fact that Joel gives us no hint as to when he lived or where he lived. We assume, because he's doing Judah and Jerusalem, we assume that he's living in Judah. We also are assuming that when he's there was no king, which is rather striking, because you now have to try to figure out, well, why was there no king? But if you go back into the Bible, you know that during the days of Ahab married his daughter off to the king of Judah. And in doing so, the king of Judah passed away. And in his place, there was nobody old enough, because his wife assassinated all of the other possibilities except one, who was hidden in the temple and protected by the priests of the temple. Now later, she will be assassinated and he will be brought out. But the only problem is he's only 4 years old. And so to replace him, he has to have somebody else helping him. And so the high priest becomes his counsel and therefore speaks for him until he becomes old enough. Now, the character, the baby's name was Joash. And you're going to find a great deal of his story in the book of Chronicles. And so that would be where you would want to go to find it, about chapter 20 in the first book of Chronicles. But that's not really where I want us to go. I want us to look at Joel from the point of view. We started months ago now, October 7th, with what I believed was the end of the age of the Gentiles. It was the end and at the beginning of what would be Israel's end. And so everything is now pointing towards Israel. Right now, we're just sitting around waiting for Iran to send its first volley of missiles back after the assassination of the Gaza leader, who very interestingly was staying in a special house in a guarded neighborhood. And yet Israel was able to assassinate him. Unbelievable. In fact, so unbelievable that, well, nobody knows how he did it. The assumption is it wasn't a missile strike, because a missile would have been a telltale shine in the sky and everybody would have noticed it. So many people believed that Israel had advanced knowledge that he would be staying there. And so they planted explosives in that house and blew up that house, not the neighbor's house, which is interesting because he hadn't been there for 6 months. So they waited 6 months before they took him out, which really left a shaking understanding for the Iranian people, because if he can take out somebody in a guarded area, why can't he take out all of the leaders of Iran? And so there's been a long, drawn-out process now, at least 2 weeks, for Iran to decide how and what they're going to do. Iran has said they're going to do something, but as of now, the best guess is it's going to be probably this weekend. But again, that's only a guess. Nobody knows for sure. Netanyahu has already sent a message to Iran, letting them know, whatever you do to us, please expect the same in return. So we could be escalating the war. Now, the war could also be escalating because Hezbollah and the Houthis and all of the other, what do you want to call them, proxies are all getting involved. And so there's going to be a rather strange thing happening, I think. It will be an all-out war eventually. But it'll be the war that probably we would see in what we would call Gog and Magog 3. And so that's where I'm intending to go tonight as we begin to look at this. But we're looking at it from the point of view of the day of the Lord. Now, in Christianity, the day of the Lord appears to be Daniel's final week as you go through listening to many of the scholars. But that's not really the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord, again, a day to God is 1,000 years. So it doesn't have to be a 7-year period. It could be whatever God deems it to be. And so we have to live with that understanding. But I want you to go first to the first part of the chapter. So we're in chapter 4. We're in the first verse of the book of Joel. Now, I've taught the rest of it, but you probably don't remember because so many things have come up since then that I've been teaching. Next week, I'm going to try to teach a section that I had taught before for friends, and that's in the book of Esdras. Esdras is not a book that you will find in your Bible, and you're not going to find it in your Jewish Bible. It's one of those books that they call the Apocrypha. Now, for thousands of years, the Apocrypha was a part of the Bible. It wasn't until about 1827 when the Christians decided it should be taken out because it doesn't help. And they're right, it doesn't. It points away from Jesus and points more towards God, skipping that whole idea. But when we go through Esdras next week, we're going to be looking at the United States. And we're going to be looking at the United States from the time of FDR all the way to present. And with the election coming up, there's a lot of ways that this whole thing can go at that point in time because we've reached the end of chapter 12. And that's the end of our story for America. So let's first begin with doing this book of Joel, and let's do the 4th chapter. And so I want you to look at the first 3 verses with me. For behold, in those days, and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem. So when did he bring back the captives? Now, as you're looking at this, I want you to understand that this is not a particular day, but a period of time. The period of time actually began back in the days of World War I. Because you see, up until then, Israel had no homeland. Now, England, who was involved in World War I, was running out of what is called acetone. Acetone was used in the making of gunpowder and the making of the flash of the gunpowder. And so they could not get the acetone they needed, so they were running into problems. And they only had a month's supply of it left at that point in time. And so they called on the science community to come up with a substitute for them. Well, a man named Chaim Weizmann did such a thing in 2 days, and he presented it to them. And they said, well, what do you want for that? And he says, simple, I want a homeland for Israel. I won't take money, and I won't give you the formula unless. And so they agreed to that. In fact, they created what's called the Balfour Declaration. Now, the Balfour Declaration really was a Christian dispensation. You see, it's called the Plymouth Brotherhood, in which Balfour and many of the scholars belonged, believed that in order for the end of time to come and for Jesus to return, we needed to have the Jews back in their homeland. And so he willingly agreed to that. Well, that was easy. The only problem was, after the war was done, England had already made a treaty and an agreement with another group of people. You see, they had just, and according to the white papers in 1925, had given away all the Middle East to England and France. And England, rather than give any land to the Jewish people, gave it to the Arabs, divided it among the Hashemite kingdom and Saudi Arabia. Now, they did that because they agreed to help England as they warred against the Turkish people, who was also in an Axis power at that point in time. And so when it was all said and done, by 1925, there was no homeland. But Jews had already begun to go back to the land. In fact, there was a great number of them. And as time wore on, coming closer to 1935 and the rise of Adolf Hitler, more people wanted to leave Europe, Jews that is, and head home. So the proclamation then becomes, well, turbulent, because England now has two contracts that they have to figure out. And so the biggest contract was going to go to the Arabs, because the Arabs had what the British wanted: oil. Oil became the bargaining chip. Israel didn't have oil. They didn't have anything. But they still had to abide by the agreement that they had made. And so eventually Israel got a foothold at the cost of a civil war. Now, as it goes on from here, it says, I will also gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And I will enter into the judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. They have also divided up my land. They have cast lots for my people, and have given a boy as payment for a harlot, and sold a girl for simply wine, that they could drink. There's a lot to unpack in that section. So we're not talking about simply the day in which Israel comes back into the land. God has another point at this time. As they come back into the land, God is preparing to get even, if we want to use those terms, all of the Gentiles who have treated Israel badly. And so he has brought Israel home, and now we're going to begin to look at what he has got for plan. It says that he will bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Wonderful. There is no valley of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was a king, and he won a great battle. He won the battle at the valley of Barakah, the valley of blessings. But there is no valley called Jehoshaphat. But the word Jehoshaphat simply means judgment. God is our judge. So as we begin to look at it then, what we're going to be looking at is the last days and the end of the Gentile rule. So we have to be in a period of time where the age of the Gentiles is over. Bingo. We've already reached it. Now, there are 2 days that are coming up that are going to be very significant in this whole thing. One is several months away, but it's called Tishri. Tishri 1, or actually Tishri 14 and 15, is Sukkot. Sukkot happens to be, at this point in time, a period in which they begin one of the Haftorah readings is Gog and Magog. A second possibility is 3 weeks later when they do Parsha Noach. Parsha Noach deals with chapter 10 and 70 nations. Well, the word Gog and Magog has a gematria of 70. So it's assumed that if Sukkot is not when it's going to happen, it will certainly happen by Parsha Noach, 3 weeks later. But that's speculation. That's not God's time. That's our time. That's what we're expecting. Maybe we're right. I want to go back up again a little bit, and I want to talk to you about when I bring back. When I bring back. Now, if you know a little bit of Hebrew, you're going to understand that this word is called ashuv. Ashuv. It's in your scriptures. In fact, if you have a Hebrew Bible, you will find it's written twice, one in parentheses. And the one that's in parentheses is actually what is actually identified as what they should be reading. Because ashiv, that's the second possibility, is when I bring back. But ashuv, which was actually written there, ashuv means I will bring rest. So he's going to bring them back, and eventually he will bring them rest. That's what's going to happen. It's not going to happen in a 7-year period, but it's going to happen. We should understand that. He says, I also will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which I talked about the fact that there isn't one. But there's also many other possibilities. Ezekiel talks about something else. Ezekiel in chapter 39 and verses 11 to 16 talks, well, why don't you flip back there for a second to Ezekiel 39? Because Ezekiel has the place that they're going to be at entirely different. In chapter 39, at the beginning, it begins by saying, now you, son of man, prophesy against Gog, saying, thus says the Lord Hashem Elohim, behold, I am against you, Gog, and the prince of leaders, which would be Rosh, and Meshach and Tubal. I will lead you astray and seduce you. So he's going to bring them down through seduction. They're not ready to come down. He's enticing them to come down. And we'll get that when we go back to Joel. Excuse me. I will cause you to ascend from the uttermost north and bring you upon the mountains of Israel. So he's going to bring this group of people he's talking about from the north. As we go through and start reading about the people that he's going to be bringing, we're going to find out that there's more than just coming from the north. In fact, if you go back to chapter 38 and we look at the same verses, by verse number 2, he begins by saying, I am against you, Gog, the prince of leader of Meshach and Tubal. Now, Meshach and Tubal originally inhabited the lands of Turkey, northern and western Turkey. Some have identified Meshach as being Moscow. In other words, the people had moved. Others said it was Tobolsk, which is Tubal. And Tobolsk is on the east side of the Ural Mountains. So one is what we would think of as the capital of the nation of Russia, but a second capital was Tobolsk. He goes on to say, I will lead you astray, and I will place hooks into your jaw and your cheeks and bring you out. So he's going to lead them here. In the last verse, in 39, he was going to entice them to come. Now he's just simply going to drag them down. And as it goes on, it says, with you our entire army, horses and riders, and all of them clothed in splendor, and a vast assembly with bucklers and shield, and all of them wielding swords. But this is where there's a change. Who's coming? Persia, Cush, and Put. Now, Persia is already in our picture. Persia is Iran. We all know that. But the other two that are there are Cush and Put. Cush and Put are Ethiopia and Libya. basically Muslim countries. But they wouldn't be coming from the north. So the question is, who's right? Or is this valley going to be not just a valley, but the entire land of Israel is going to be exploited? He goes on to say after that, with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer. Gomer again is found originally in Turkey, but Gomer also is said to be Germany, and his cohorts, Togomar, which is Turkey today, and the uttermost parts of the north, which is the area of the Ashkenazi Jew, the area of Germany, the area of Poland, those places, northern Europe. All of them are going to be coming down. So they could be going to this valley called Jehoshaphat, which nobody knows where it is. If you're a Christian, you understand they're coming to Armageddon. Well, actually, they're coming to Har Megiddo. That's the Greek. Har is a mountain. Well, it's not actually a mountain. It's a tell. It's a series of cities that have been built on top of each other. And after the city's been ruined, they build another city on top of it. And it's called a tell. The valley is right next to this tell. And that's the valley of Megiddo. That's where most people think it's going to happen. But there's more to the story than that, because as you see, as we're going through this, there's going to be another hint of something else that's going on. Oh, by the way, chapter 39, verses 11 to 16, which I was starting through. In verse 11, it says, "And it shall be on that day that I will assign Gog the burial site in Israel." Where's the burial site? The Valley of the Passengers. Okay, where's the Valley of the Passengers? Actually, the Valley of the Passengers does exist, but it's in Jordan, not in Israel. You see, when people came down, merchants were traveling in caravans. They had two ways to go from Babylonia and Assyria. One was called the Via Mara, where they would go along the coast of the Mediterranean. Megiddo was important there because Megiddo was where they would be taxed. Ahab set up a city and he set up a tax system so that the merchants would be taxed at that point in time, an official toll booth. But there was another way that they could go south, and that was called along the King's Highway. Now, Israel didn't own the King's Highway. That was in the area that belonged to the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites. Excuse me. But they did come down, and then they got even with the Dead Sea, about the middle of the Dead Sea. And I don't know how many of you have been there, can use your sanctified imaginations. But when I was there, if you were standing at Ein Gedi, the place where David hid, where they have the flowing water, straight across was the Valley of Passengers. It came down onto the shore, and you would continue along. And when you got down to the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, or Sea of Dead Sea, there would be another taxing station down there to make sure that they collected all of their money. Solomon built that second one. In fact, that's where Solomon stored some of his horses. Remember when he married the Pharaoh's daughter, the Pharaoh's daughter gave him 1,000 horses. Well, according to the scriptures, kings aren't supposed to have horses. And they're certainly not supposed to have 1,000 of them. But he had some of them down in the area of the Aravot, and he had some at Megiddo, and he had the rest in a stable there in Jerusalem. His 1,000 horses. So as we're going through then, this place that this is going to happen is I will bury you in the Valley of the Passengers. Now, one of the rabbis that I've listened to said, well, centuries ago, there was a battle there, and there were graves that were dug at that point. But nobody seems to remember, and I can't find it in any history books. I just know that it's what was said, but it's not, I can't find any references to it. So there's the Valley of Passengers, or what will eventually be called the Valley of Hamon-Gog. But that's not it. You see, the Muslims also identify that there's going to be a great battle in Israel. Now, the battle won't work out the same way that God is working it out in the Old Testament here. In fact, it's in the book of Hadith, which is in the Quran, in which there will be this greatest Armageddon, the Al-Hamalah, which is also called the Great Battle. So there will be a great battle in which Israel will fall, which is part of the spurring on of the Persians, the Iranians, who believe as mullahs that they are entitled to this land. Now, remember, last week I had Larry Borntrager on. When I had Larry on, the thing that I wanted you to understand is that the Muslims started this war, or the Hamas started this war on October 7th because they said that they were trying to prevent the Jewish extremists from blowing up the mosque on top of the Temple Mount. And if they were going to be able, it was the Dome of the Rock, actually, and Alaska Mosque. So those were the things that they were going to destroy. So they had a preemptive war. And so on January 10th, they let everybody know that's the reason that this whole thing started. Whether it did or not, I'm not sure. But the idea is that's what you're supposed to think. So we have in the Quran, Armageddon. But we also have something else. We also have the understanding in the book of Zechariah that the battle itself is going to take place at Jerusalem in the Kidron Valley. Well, the Kidron Valley is between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount itself. So is that valley big enough? It is if we begin to include all of the places that people are talking about, that there will be enough room, because remember, we're inviting all the Gentile armies, not a couple, all of them. Now imagine the U.S. being caught over there. Oh, they're already there. You see, we have outposts in just about every possible place in the Middle East. Not only do we have outposts everywhere, but if you've been looking at a map on a news channel, you have to know that there are basically 4 different places that we have fleets of Navy there to intercept missiles that are going to go from Iran to Israel, or at least that's what it appears. So we have lots of things that are going to be going on. So it says that I will enter into judgment with them on account of my people. Well, what does he mean? Well, let's take Babylon, for example. Now, Babylon was God's chosen. God chose to have the Babylonians invade Judah, and eventually they will destroy the temple. And eventually they will empty out the nation. But in doing so, they're going to go beyond what God wanted them to do. Therefore, they have a strike against them that God will eventually call into question. And I don't believe that question's been answered yet, but will be at the end of time. Look at chapter 4, look at verse 4. Indeed, what you are doing, or what you are, try it again. Indeed, what are you to me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the coasts of Philistia? Will you retaliate against me? But if you retaliate against me swiftly and speedily, I will return your retaliation upon your own head, because you have taken my silver, my gold, and have carried into the temples my prized possessions. Also, the people of Judah and the people of Jerusalem you have sold to the Greeks. Now, by selling to the Greeks, I believe he's talking about to the Gentiles. So you sold it to the Greeks that you may remove them far from the borders. And behold, I will raise them out of the place to which you have sold them, and I will return your retaliation upon your own head. And I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hands of the people of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabaeans, a people far off, for the Lord has spoken. Okay, notice the 3 nations that he picks out. Well, actually, they're not even nations. Well, one is, Philistia as a nation. The other two are cities, Tyre and Sidon. They both were a part of the Phoenician Empire, but he particularly mentions those two. Now, if we're looking at today's map, Phoenicia, the Phoenicians having Tyre and Sidon, lo and behold, that's Lebanon. Those are two of the strongholds of Hezbollah. If we look down to the Philistia, we're looking at Gaza. Now, notice what he says. If you attack, he will retaliate. But again, it says, will you retaliate against him? What did he do that you're going to retaliate? Nothing. This is all smoke. They say, this is what you've done, and this is what we're going to do. And what's going on right now is God retaliating. This retaliation, I think, is going to lead to a far larger problem that we're going to be seeing in the next months. But that's the beginning of the story, not the end. I want you to go back to the book of Ezekiel, if you would, and I want you again to go to chapter 38. Well, I guess we've already been there. So let me just remind you. Chapter 38, we're looking at nations coming, and among the nations coming is Persia. Persia is a key. We know that there's called today an axis of evil. The axis of evil includes Iran and Russia. Now, if all the nations come down, that would include China. Well, China has 100 million men in their and women in their army. Imagine, where are you going to put 100 million? And where are you going to put the Iranians? Where are you going to put the Persians? Where are you going to put North Korea? Where are you going to put all these people? It must be a massive, massive area that would take care of all of these people. Swiftly and speedily, I will return your retaliation upon your heads. God says they attack and we retaliate. And that is what is going on right now. That's what we're watching on television. That's what's happening. Now look at verse 4. Notice how plainly he speaks. Why is this happening? Because you have taken my silver and my gold and have carried into your temples my prized possessions. Well, what's his prized possessions? The temple artifacts. Now, not all of them are in these temples or in these other countries. In fact, it's understood that Babylon has the menorah, or at least a good copy of the menorah, because remember, Solomon made 10 menorahs in his temple, and he made 10 tables of showbread. He also made the altar of incense. All of these things are there for which he will retaliate. But what's worse than that is the human trafficking. Notice, you're going to sell the boys that you take for a prostitute. That's not very much value. In fact, if you go back to the book of Genesis and you look at the cost, what Joseph was worth, he was worth a prostitute. That was the amount of money they paid to get Joseph. And if you look to see how much they paid for women, they didn't. They traded drink for them. A jug, if you will, depending on how good looking she was. Imagine what's going on. You know, in Israel today, after the fall of Russia, many of the Russian Jews who also were a part of the Russian mafia moved to Israel. They moved to Eilat, southern Israel, the southern point. They've established gambling casinos and all kinds of things down there. It's its own version of the Wild West, but yet at the same time, it's also a tourist trap. But the assumption is they're still going a network of dealing with humans, human trafficking. We also know that in Tel Aviv, they're one of the stations where they actually are manipulating the internet, stealing information, selling information. Lots of things are going on in Israel that are not good. Look at verse 9. Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare for war. Wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near. Let them come up. Now remember, Israel is up. That doesn't mean that they're coming just from the south. When you get to the Temple Mount, you are going up to get to the Temple Mount. But notice what happens here. Beat your swords, or beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears. And then let the weak say, I am strong. Assemble and come, all you nations gather together. Notice that they're going to have to use farm implements in order to outfit their armies. Now, some say that that's because God is bringing them up several times and therefore they're going to run out of things to bring. So they're going to have to use farm implements, making them into swords, making them into spears, all of those things. Others simply say, as in the Korean War, China didn't have enough guns to put in everybody's hands, so the guns were in the hands of the front row marching into the battle. And as they fell, the guy behind him picked up the rifle and kept on going. They simply overwhelmed the United States with sheer number. Now that could possibly be. He goes on to say after this, cause your mighty ones to go down there, O Lord. Now remember, he's also said the weak ones are coming. There will be so many people that will become a part of the crowd. They wouldn't have gone otherwise, but the fervor of what's going on will draw them in, and they too will come down or come up. Let the nations be awakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, the valley of judgment. For there I will sit to judge. Notice, he's going to sit to judge. He's not even going to stand. How simple an understanding this is. I don't even have to stand up to defeat you. So he's going to sit to judge all the surrounding nations. So put a sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Cut down, the winepress is full. The vat overflows, for their wickedness is great. Notice he says, put the sickle into the harvest. Well, if you're putting the sickle into the harvest, what season are you in? You see, there are three basic seasons or temple times of worship. Passover, which was the season of the barley harvest. Shavuot, which was the season of the wheat harvest. And grapes were harvested at Shavuot. Is he trying to tell us about how things are going to happen and how spread out in terms of time this is going to be? If you were looking at the Talmud, and I can't remember my sections anymore, the rabbis will tell you that they love to teach this stuff, but they don't want to be here when it happens. Why do you think they won't want to be here when it happens? It will be a mess. Lots of problems are going to be happening. What happens when everybody leaves to go to battle? How do you get them there? If they're leaving from the United States or from South America, or if they're leaving from China coming across. I remember when I was teaching Revelations how we dried up the Euphrates River and they would walk across in that area. Well, that doesn't have to happen anymore because the Euphrates is almost dried up anyway because of the dams that were built inside of Lebanon and Syria. So there's definitely going to be a lot of things happening. Lots of things are going to happen. If we're already there, imagine this. The United States, according to President Biden, is trying to negotiate a treaty to end this whole thing. The only problem is Gaza doesn't plan to go. Well, why isn't Gaza going to come? Well, because the fact they believe that the political end is already in sight, that they're going to win anyway. Why? Because there is so much hullabaloo in the United States and across the world in favor of the Palestinian cause that they're not going to negotiate. We're just going to see it all happen, come to an end, and they win. That's not what God says, but that's what they're thinking. Turn in your Bibles to Psalms 2. Now, I'm sure many of you read Psalms 2 multiple times, especially if you follow the ideas of reading through your scriptures. But in Psalms 2, it's rather fascinating in the very beginning. It begins by saying, "Why do the nations rage?" Do you remember that line? Why do the nations rage? What is that? Well, anyway, why do the nations rage and the people plot in vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Now, that doesn't mean a Messiah. The word anointed here can just simply mean multiple people, such as Jewish people altogether. Let us break their hands or their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens, that's God, shall laugh, and the Lord shall hold them in derision. Then he shall speak to them in his wrath. And I want you to remember that, in his wrath, and distress them in his deep displeasure. Now, they're going to beat their swords into plowshares. That's going to be the scope of the battle in Ezekiel, and it's going to be the battle in Zechariah. But there's more that's going to happen at that point. Let the nations be awakened and come to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit in judgment. Do you remember Psalms? He sits there. We're looking at a scripture ahead of time. Book of Psalms tells us why they've gotten together and they've plotted against Israel and against the Jewish people. He goes on to say at this point in time, let the nations be awakened. Put the sickle in. Now, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, verses 2 and 3, it says, wherefore art thou red in thine apparel, and thy garments like he who treads in a winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone. Who is he? He is God. God will do this by himself. Israel will be involved in the battle, but the eventual outcome will not be decided by the Jewish army. It'll be decided by God. He will make it happen. Now, this idea goes maybe a little bit further when it says, in mine anger and in their lifeblood is sprinkled on my garments. In other words, he is the one who's bringing judgment. He is the one. In Joel 14-17, as we move through this, it begins by saying, multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. Now it's called the valley of decision. Earlier, it was called the valley of judgment, valley of Jehoshaphat. For the day of the Lord, again, here we go. The day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. Multitudes, multitudes. The Hebrew word is ethnics, ethnics. In other words, we're talking about ethnics as groups. There were 70 ethnic groups way back in the book of Genesis. We're going to be looking at lots of ethnic groups, multiple groups coming, all the nations. What's happening? The sun and the moon will grow dark and the stars will diminish in their brightness. And I and the Lord will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. Now, remember what we read in the book of Psalms, where it talks about the loud voice, the voice of his wrath. The heavens and the earth will shake, but the Lord will be a shelter for his people and the strength of the children of Israel. So you shall know that I am who roars from Zion and shall emit his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall tremble. Then Jerusalem shall be holy, and strangers shall not pass through her again. Multitudes, multitudes, ethnics, all of them will be there. Now, this idea of smoke, this idea of pillars of fire, all of those things tend to throw you back to the Passover season, when again everything becomes dark. If you go up on Mount Sinai in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, or if you're there in chapter 19 and 20 in the book of Exodus, a great deal of darkness. Also in this darkness, we find ourselves that it talks about the blood of the moon and all of those other things. The moon and the sun represent two portions of the calendar, the night sky. And if you go to the book of Sefer Yetzirah, you understand that those portions have an effect on this earth and on us. I know when I was living in Indiana, when January and February rolled around, I was disgusting. Why? Because it was dark so many days. I became depressed by it. But as I'm down here, I don't get depressed by it. But again, I got plenty of sunshine, but the temperature is 99, 100 degrees, so I still don't go outside. But at least I'm not depressed. You understand what I'm trying to say? The idea is the fact that they hold something. In the book of Daniel, Daniel was in prayer, and for 21 days, he prayed earnestly and wasn't receiving an answer. Do you remember why? It was the Prince of Persia, an angelic force, a star maybe, or a constellation, where the angel is covering or hovering over the nation of Persia. And he didn't want Daniel to understand what the future held. You see, he didn't want anybody to know the future, because the future would have meant he would have been lost. And so he attempts to interfere with that. So there's plenty of things that are happening. But now we're into the valley of decision, according to the book of Joel. And it says that at that point that it's going to be total darkness, the moon, the blood, everything. And so we're looking at something that's going to be quite different than what we're normally thinking of. Radak believes that at the same time that there's this earthquake, which is also mentioned in the book of Ezekiel in chapter 38 and also mentioned in Zechariah chapter 14, that this is not going to be just an earthquake that shakes Jerusalem or shakes Israel, but the world will shake. Not only will the world shake, but he also says that his voice is like a roar. Understand that when the people were standing below on Mount Zion, or on Mount Sinai, they all heard his voice. But there are stories that say that the voice was so loud that it carried to the other nations. Everybody heard. Imagine the power of that voice. Now imagine just a lightning strike that comes down next to you. Imagine the sound of the thunder, the lightning. That's God's voice. Imagine it. So you shall know that I am who roars from Zion and shall emit his voice from Jerusalem. That means God is back in Jerusalem. Imagine, can you feel his presence? If he's there, now there's no temple at this point in time. The temple probably won't be built until after. Joel 4:18 goes on to say, and it will come to pass in that day that the mountains shall drip with new wine. The hills shall flow with milk, and all the brooks of Judah shall be flooded with water. A fountain shall flow from the house of the Lord to the Shittim Valley. Now, the Shittim Valley is actually, it's a valley with the acacia trees in it. It's the same valley where Jacob, before he moved to Egypt, went and actually dug up shittim or acacia trees and brought them down to where they were at in Egypt for the purposes of helping them to build the temple or the tabernacle's artifacts. All of that's there. Now Egypt shall eventually become desolation, and Edom also will be desolate wilderness because of the violence against the people of Judah. For they have shed innocent blood in their land, but Judah shall abide forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. For I will acquit them of the blood, or of the guilt of the bloodshed, whom I had not acquitted, for the Lord dwells in Zion. So we have this water flowing. I know you probably remember the scripture verse that it says that the desert will bloom like a rose. They're talking about the Arava, which is southern Israel, which is a desert now. At one time, it did bloom. In fact, there's plenty of water under there, deep underneath.
Which one did you get those out of?
Which one did I get what out of? Hello? Okay. Anyway, back to the story. The exact location of Shittim really isn't known. The best guess is that Shittim was actually on the east or west side of the Jordan River, just north of the Dead Sea. That's where they assume it's going to be. In fact, there's a wadi there. It's called Wadi El Nan. That's the wadi that this water is supposedly going to flow through as it goes from the Temple Mount all the way down to the Sea of the Dead Sea, and from the Dead Sea into the Mediterranean. Well, the Dead Sea doesn't have an exit. In other words, all the water it takes in simply evaporates. There's no exit of the water, and that's why the salt content continues to get stronger. That's why when you go to Israel and you go down to the Dead Sea, you get to float on the salt water. But there will come a time when that water will have an exit. But at that same time that the water is going to have an exit, it's going to flow into the Mediterranean. So you got salt water flowing into the Mediterranean. But if you go to the book of Ezekiel in chapter 36, they talk to us about the fact that there's this cleanliness that's going to happen in all of Israel. Goes back to Larry Borntrager, the ashes of the red heifer. That which is what he was digging for, which is what he was protecting and helping to take care of these last couple of months. And he's going to go back and do it again later this spring. But the understanding is the fact that water will become clean. Not only will the water become clean, but the water will become fresh. Imagine all the water in the world becoming fresh water. There won't be any longer anybody who's going to suffer from dying from hunger or malnutrition because there's no water for them. The water will be plentiful everywhere. And the deserts will bloom like a rose because all the water will become fresh water. Now, there's been a couple of periods of time in the last few years when there has been floods that have flooded the Jordan River and gone down. And for a period of time, freshwater fish were actually living in the northern end of the Dead Sea. But that's only temporary, not yet ready to come. So he's going to sprinkle clean water upon you, and you will become clean from all of your impurities, and all your abominations will I cleanse you. And I will give you a new heart. This is the book of Ezekiel, chapter 36. And I'll give you a new heart and a new spirit, and I will put them within you, and I will take away the heart of stone out of your flesh, and I will give you the heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and bring you about that you will walk in my statutes and you will keep my ordinances. That's where it's going to happen. Okay, I've talked for an hour. This is chapter 11 in the book of, or chapter 4 in the book of Joel. This is the last chapter, but I've given you, I think, enough to think about. Anybody have any thoughts after listening for this long? Don't mean to talk for an hour, but that's what it ended up being. So if you have anything you'd like to ask or say, I'd appreciate talking with you.